Jose, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate seeing you again. I guess we met a while ago during a concert you did for The Life You Can Save.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you again. And I remember when we joined during the pandemic time to talk a bit.
Well, there's different kinds of pandemics now, political pandemics and all kinds of pandemics. But, well, are you in Mendoza? That's what I was told, that you're touring and that you're in Mendoza.
Yeah, exactly. I'm playing in Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. And in between these 2 weekends, I'm having some time with family and my dad in Mendoza, Argentina.
Well, interestingly enough, I was in Mendoza with my daughter several years ago, who's a grown woman now with 2 kids of her own, and she was the one who introduced me to your music initially. And so it seemed very appropriate. We're in Mendoza, and my son, years before that, introduced me to Nick Drake, who I understand was something of an influencer on you.
Yeah, definitely. Alongside with many Latin American artists, Nick Drake was definitely the one who was part of my sound when I started back in almost 20 years ago.
So what you will learn as your children grow up is that they have quite a lot of influence on you. And so I think my kids, Noah and Kayla, have been really influential on my own development. I think hopefully mostly for the positive, although sometimes they increase what you might call your inner critic.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see what my children will do to me.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about what they've already done later in the interview. But I wanted to ask you to begin. I named this podcast Musing About Ourselves and Other Strangers, and it's a purposely ambiguous title. But I was wondering, you, with your creative mind, what you might do with that title, what it might mean to you, Musings About Ourselves and Other Strangers.
Musing, it's a word I don't know that well.
So do you know it? So should I try to translate it or explain what it means?
Please.
Musing to me is like quietly thinking, something that I imagine you do quite a lot. And you could have images, you could have thoughts, but it doesn't really mean that it's images, and it doesn't really mean that it's thoughts. It's sort of a mixture of those things, and you're quietly thinking. So that's the best I can do with musings.
Yeah, well, the way that I go around thinking my thoughts is most of the time randomly, but once in a while I go into a book or a podcast, and then all of a sudden everything comes into place and more organized frameworks. But my personal thoughts can be around my own persona, my friends, and all of a sudden think about bigger topics, global topics, and then people on the other side of the world.
The phrase other strangers was meant to refer to seeing ourselves sometimes as a stranger. Do you resonate with that idea at all?
Yeah, definitely. Especially since maybe the last 10 or 15 years, I've been trying to figure out who I am. And some of the things that I've been doing is meditating and recognizing that I don't really know who I am, and I'm different persons in different situations. And sometimes I can stumble upon memories of stuff that I've said or stuff that I've done and feel like I'm not a coherent person through time. So yeah, and of course I get surprised sometimes about my reactions to things, and so in many ways I'm a stranger to myself.
We'll come back to this idea about strangers and being a stranger to oneself, or musings, and how it affects what we think about the world around us and our role in the world later in this discussion. But I'd like to get back to your early life, if that's okay.
Sure.
As I understand it, your parents fled Argentina during the dictatorship in 1976. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And they went to Brazil and then to Sweden, where you were born a couple of years later.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd love to hear that story, and maybe you could weave in what I was going to ask at the end, which is, do you think that led to political discussions or discussions in your home about the world as you were growing up, because your parents had been involved in fleeing the dictatorship?
Yeah, my parents and my then sister that was 2 years old. They fled Argentina. My parents were at the university in San Luis, studying psychology on my dad's side and biochemistry on my mother's side. And my dad was involved politically in a youth group. There were young Peronistas. When the dictatorship took power, they were among the targets. So they were lucky that they didn't get caught, fled through Brazil, as you mentioned, through Rio, and were basically begging for food or shelter during half a year until the Swedish embassy helped them to relocate. And that's where I was born and my brother was born. And yeah, so growing up in Sweden, I grew up, with Spanish at home, Swedish with my friends. But yeah, every time we were eating dinner, very often the radio was on with the news from Latin America. And yeah, politics was a huge part of my dad's interest, and it was difficult not to soak in some of that, of all those thoughts that he had, and the discussions that he and my mom would have. I think that affected me later in life in terms of growing up in Sweden and being a culture that cares about the world, but still lives in a bubble where things that happen in different parts of the world, they don't feel as real. So in my sense, it wasn't that real because I always lived in Sweden, but still I had this, once in a while my dad would comment or tell a story about some friend that got killed or tortured, and all of a sudden, like, you realize that, oh yeah, they were my parents were some of the lucky ones, and but his interest in politics wasn't that narrow. It was also about doing good and thinking in terms of the poorest people, and I mean, one of the reasons they got chased by the country was that they were so left wing, and left wing, in my mind, many times has to do with trying to figure out how to make the people who have the worst opportunities to help them thrive. So yeah, I come from a very sort of left-leaning family that talked a lot about politics.
That's similar to my own upbringing, although my parents didn't suffer in that way. And also, I think the upbringing that my children had, sometimes their friends would comment. I remember one friend commented that coming to dinner at our house was like being in a social studies class. I don't know if that was a positive comment or a negative comment.
I mean, that's the feeling that I had at home, but I have to be honest that I many times I just zoomed out and was thinking in my own thoughts, and I cared about skateboards and and playing bass in the hardcore band, and yeah.
So I think that's an interesting segue into the, we'll get back to the concern about poor people later on in our discussion, but it seems that you're saying you kind of maybe zoned out a little bit and got into your own thoughts. And it seems like your early music, and correct me if I'm wrong, is not particularly political or focused on the downtrodden, but is more focused on your inner thoughts and the whole concept of thinking. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to study myself as thinking about my former self as a stranger, and I can notice that my first album back in 2003, Veneer, was more about inner struggles, personal thoughts about things that are authentic versus not more shiny or polished. Those were my interests at the moment when I was writing the lyrics. Actually, the last song on that album was some sort of like progressive, revolutionary type of lyric that I recognize part of that sort of left-leaning posture that I had is in that album, but it's only like one final song.
I don't recall, but can you just tell us a little bit what the lyrics to that song were?
Save Your Day is the name of the song. It was pretty harsh. Poke the body with a stick, roll it down, ignore the moaning as it tumbles to the ground. Be brave and save your day. So it's very revolutionary. I was thinking about sort of cultures and how some cultures have to move on quicker. I can say I stand for the lyric in the same sense today, but there was a sense of of a revolutionary ambition when I was writing that lyric. But it's a minor part of that album, where most of the album is more about inner demons, basically, or relationship stories also.
Pretty early on in your life, you decided to pursue a career in science. I guess that was perhaps your mother's influence at the time, and you went to get a PhD. What was that experience like, and why did you leave the program? A lot of people do. By the way, I just as background, I have a PhD in psychology, and I do have some interesting questions about that. But how did all of that affect you? Or
yeah, so this was before that first album. I was studying at the university in Gothenburg and took my master's in molecular biology, and it was basically following the footsteps of my mom, but also my dad was. I remember when I had to choose between choosing music as a career or the university, he was really, even though he was the musical part of the family, he felt strongly that you should study and and you can still have music on the side. So yeah, both of them influenced me to choose molecular biology, and then I went to study viruses in a research group. I thought it was super interesting to try to figure out how all these small or big molecules make us who we are. So how the interactions between atoms and even electrons make us super complex organisms that we are, that can do what we're doing now, like sharing information with each other and sharing images. So to me, that's still a super interesting topic, but when I was in my early 20s, I was studying herpes viruses, and I was in a cold lab trying to produce enough proteins to try to figure out the structure and function when they interact with DNA. But yeah, I didn't have that many results, and once I released my first solo EP, it sort of took off in a way where it was pretty obvious to me and my professor that I wasn't gonna come back anytime soon.
in a way, that's kind of a reductive study. You're studying the level of organization at the molecular, cellular level. But it seems that you got very interested in the concept of mind, how one thinks about themselves. That became much more a part of your manifest self than the biochemistry or the more reductive approach.
When I started touring, I was happy to leave academia. But then after 2-3 years, I felt like I was missing learning stuff. And that's when I started to read more and more. And one of the main topics that interested me was consciousness and the mind and how it works and what we know and what we don't know. Yeah, it still feels like one of the most interesting topics in the universe.
Well, it's also, of course, very interesting to me. What I am interested in is how we know our own thoughts and feelings, how we know what we believe and what our values are. And my sense was, as a graduate student in the research I did, was that the best way to derive what you think about what you believe as a person, what your feelings are, is by observing yourself and your behavior in the same way that you would observe somebody else's behavior, and then infer from that what your feelings and thoughts are and what your beliefs and values are. So it's looking at yourself in a behavioral sense.
Yeah, I'm a fan of all kinds of studies, and including the sort of introspective studies that are limited, but you can still try to approach some sort of objective knowledge about our thoughts, and I think meditation is a great way to try to figure out what bubbles up involuntarily. But I'm a fan of many types of studies, and I'm a fan of the ones where you figure out our biases through different smart studies of students.
Do you think that looking at yourself, just how you behave, is an important way to discover what you're thinking and feeling and what your values are?
Yeah, although that can be difficult, I think that sounds reasonable. And I have to mention that one of the best ways for me to make music is to play music and then listen to it in a different moment, in a different setting. And that gives me a view on myself that it surprised me sometimes. And in a similar way, you can film yourself while you're doing something, and all of a sudden you see that, oh, I'm having my shoulder up this way, and so just recording yourself and looking at yourself from different angles, it can really be interesting and gives you insight to who you are. To be good at observing yourself, I think it can be a bit difficult though, because we are who we are, and it's difficult to be objective about oneself.
I noted that at one point you said that you found that when you smile, it made you happier, which really is at the center of my own research when I was a graduate student. I'm just curious what your experience with the whole idea of changing your behavior and noticing a change in your feelings.
I guess I've been becoming more and more aware of myself through reading books about psychology, about behavior. I think many of those findings I've been adopting them, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. And yeah, just priming myself is one of the things that I've been doing. Instead of going to news in the morning, I try to do something where I move my body to, and maybe if I see myself in a mirror, try to smile instead of yeah.
You still notice that when you smile, you do feel better.
Yeah, I think that I feel it, and the science suggests that it should be something that works. Somato-psychic effects.
Have you ever noticed that you feel like you believe one thing, but you actually do something that really doesn't support that value or that belief? Have you ever looked at yourself in that way?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say very, very often there's a cognitive clash, dissonance between perfect version of me and who I actually am. And I guess that's one of the things that I feel like I've been trying to reconcile those two things the last, I would say, decade, to try to be a good person, but understand that fallible, like most are. I feel like I'm conscious about that imbalance, and I'm actually okay with the imbalance nowadays. Because I see a difference between having high ambitions and at least going towards those high ambitions, and being a fatalist, where you understand that you're fallible, and then you're just relax too much and just stay with that fallibility. So and now I know if I'm aiming at one direction and I'm at least going towards that direction, I'm doing something that I think is better than to be a fatalist that just sits down and gives up.
So you're really exploring what might be at the heart of what I'm trying to get at in this general podcast when I interview people, which is, how do you deal with the fact that there is often a very big gap between what you believe and how you think you should act in the world to be a good person and the way you actually act, which I think you refer to almost as fatalism versus doing good. Am I understanding you correctly?
Maybe I could use other words, but those are the two that popped up as two different extremes. So in my mind, being a good person involves being friendly and nice to people, and it could be responding an email in a certain way. It can be so many things that it becomes daunting if you try to think about all the details.
You can get overwhelmed with all the ways that one needs to be good versus maybe some natural instincts to be more self-interested. But I'm wondering if this kind of dilemma is one of the things that led you to effective altruism, because I know that you have been interested in effective altruism and you've been supportive of the Life You Can Save, the organization that I co-founded with Peter Singer. How did you get involved in effective altruism at the beginning, and how is it affecting your life, or this tension between fatalism on the one hand and doing good on the other hand?
Yeah, I was trying to go through my emails and inbox, try to figure out when I got hooked to the ideas. And so one is, of course, through Peter Singer, and I always looked up whenever he had a new talk or topic that he focused on. I followed it, and is it 2009, I think, when the book came out?
The book was in 2009, correct?
Yeah.
And then the updated book was 2019.
Yeah. So in 2009, I got into the ideas and started to process the idea of cost-benefit analysis, and even before that, I saw a TED talk by economist Björn Lomborg that had similar ideas, but they were more in terms of what types of policies where we should spend money on a sort of more country level. But yeah, I was getting into these type of cost benefit analysis. Where can you get the best bang for the buck? Where can you put your resources if you want to do the most good you can? And I remember thinking about it a lot, and I noticed that I gave my first like $500 back in 2011. So it's around that time that I started thinking about it, and it wasn't until 2000, I think 15 or 16, when I started to give a bit more substantially, and partly because of a side project that didn't do as well economically, so I wasn't sure I could give a substantial percentage. But yeah, so it's been a process for me to know about the ideas of which is only one part of effective altruism, which is giving to an effective charity, and then for me to find a percentage that felt good, and yeah, I gave the pledge to give 10%, at least 10%. I can't remember which year, but I did that, and since then it's been what I do, and I've been switching between Give Well or Life You Can Save, or giving individually to different organizations. But yeah, it's been so process of many years now.
Do you find that by making this pledge of 10% or giving to these highly effective charities, you're helping resolve the dissonance between we'll call it fatalism and doing good? Is it emotionally satisfying to you? Does it work?
Yeah, it does, and it's in a similar way to when I'm happy to pay taxes. I live in Sweden. The taxes are pretty high, and still you walk on the street and there might be some homeless person, and this is one of the richest, most prosperous places on earth, and still we have structural problems. We have people who can't get healthcare in time. I know it doesn't solve a problem, but at least it goes towards solving a problem. I feel like it helped my cognitive dissonance a bit, or quite a lot actually, because it's we mentioned that effective altruism isn't only to give to effective charities. It's also you can study how the world works and how try to read about the biggest problems and try to see where there are solutions and which problems don't have solutions. And for me, effective altruism is also a framework for thinking about the world's biggest problems, and try to put each problem in a framework, basically, where in that sense it gives clarity to the thinking, and becomes more manageable in my mind. If you can go to a chart and see, okay, this disease causes this many deaths, and all of a sudden you have numbers and you have proportions. So it goes in line with the term factfulness that Hans Rosling, or maybe the Roslings, coined. The idea that through having a fact-based worldview, you will feel a sense of calm, because then you won't have as many bumps into false beliefs that clash with reality. So in the same sense, I think effective altruism is once you have these lists, basically, of things that are bad, things that could get better, you get a sense of proportion, and also a sense of that you can actually do stuff in the world, the things that have a chance to change.
Working at The Life You Can Save has had a similar effect on me. I feel like other than raising these wonderful children and having this wonderful marriage, I haven't really done much for the world, even though when I was young in the university, I expected to be an activist, maybe like your dad. But I didn't really do that. And I found that I've resolved some of this dissonance by being involved in The Life You Can Save and helping the poorest people in the world in a cost-effective, high-impact manner. So I experienced some of the same calm, if you will, for not being a very good person in many ways, to help the people that most need it. And, my hope is that other people will see this opportunity as well to resolve the dissonance between their values and how they actually live. I'm curious for you, Jose, if this has found its way into your music or whether your effective altruism, if you will, is on one hand and your music is something completely different.
It's found its way into the music lately, and I feel like it's been a journey in trying to figure out something to write about that for me feels important. Ever since my first album, I switched from very introvert to more and more outward looking and looking at the world. So there are songs that I'm just trying to write something that sounds good, like lyrically sounds good, maybe just gives a hint to words that makes you get into a certain mindset. But I have a couple of songs that are more specific, and one of them is Every Age from my third album, which dealt with the idea of a zeitgeist, and I was thinking about the global times. And on the latest album, I have a song called Visions, which I see as the humanist and the effective altruism anthem in my catalog.
Can you share the words of that song with the listeners?
Visions, trying to make sense of the now, trying to make sense of the past to show us how. Visions, imagining the worlds that could be, shaping a mosaic of fates for all sentient beings. And the lyrics goes on. Maybe we can have the link to the song. But
Right.
I just continue repeating the word visions and then mentioning stuff like that has to do with the growth and decay of nature and how to sort of work with the natural laws that aren't really in our favor.
So it sounds like you're actually extending your view from just thinking about the poorest people to thinking about the climate. And then you mentioned the word sentient beings, and I'm thinking about Peter Singer and his fight for justice of non-human beings and all sentient human beings. Did you read Animal Liberation, or has that affected you as well?
Yeah, I read Animal Liberation, and I was playing hardcore music, being part of the straight edge movement, where me and all my friends all of a sudden yeah, let's stop eating meat. Yes, we all became vegetarians and vegans for a while. But in our group of friends, I felt like, okay, I need to read about this. And I went to the library and picked up Animal Liberation. And it was a big inspiration as a teenager. And had my first intellectual fight with my dad as a Argentinian meat eater.
I was going to say it's a big contradiction between being Argentinian.
Yeah. So we had it was quite funny because he got upset. So are you calling me an assassin? Assassin are the ones that kill humans. I was like, yeah, in sort of a way. But yeah, so Animal Liberation was a huge inspiration, and at the same time, like being open about my contradictions as a person and who I want to be. I'm still eating cheese. I look forward to the day where we have cheese without animals. But yeah, so I'm not strict, but I totally aim towards a world with more and more vegan food.
Well, that gets me really to my final question, which is a big question, and I understand that a lot of your work on yourself is about resolving the contradictions between fatalism and activism or being a good person. And I think we find when we become active in trying to solve problems in a world in which we feel powerless, we feel a lot better. And I think that what I'm hearing from you is that is really continues to be a really healing part of your life. and that you're much more at peace with the part of you that isn't necessarily always working to be a better person day in and day out, or to give the most to sentient beings or poor people. But the final question I wanted to ask you, Jose, is what does it mean to you to live a moral life?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot without working on it too much. So I think about it more than I do. So I read about the books of moral philosophers, and I sort of take it in, and then all of a sudden I'm waking up. I need to do some exercises so my brain works well. I cook some food. I take my kids to kindergarten. I answer some emails. I rehearse some guitar. So to be a moral person, of all the motions that you can do as a person, it can be daunting to think that every motion has its place, and one motion is positive and one is less positive, one is negative, one is even more negative. What I'm trying to say is that to be a moral person is, to me, it started clicking once you start thinking about cost benefit, and once you have something that you can measure, all of a sudden you can see that something that you thought was very moral might be unimportant or even negative. Many people that see themselves as moral might be part of a movement that, and I'm thinking about the Catholic Church preventing the spreading of condoms in poorer countries. These might be people that see themselves very moral. So
you're talking about liberation theology, or
Catholicism, and the way they looked at
birth control, or
birth control. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that once you start measuring things and study what leads people or sentient beings towards flourishing and less towards suffering, that's when you can start to figure out what makes a better world, what makes a moral way of living. And that's when you notice that some things might have a huge impact and some don't. And so, for example, our psychology makes us feel bad about some things that might not have a big impact on the world at all. But still, we put a lot of effort in trying to be sort of moral in some sense, but without having an impact. So I think that's where I try to be one of those that tries to read about how our actions make an impact or not in the flourishing of other human beings. And so just going back to simple things, like smiling at another person might be a way to make that person feel better, which is important. But knowing that if you smile too much at another person, that person will think that you're a psycho and will feel anxious. So it's a very complex world we live in, and I think that's one of the nice things with effective altruism movement is try to focus on the things we know and the things we are getting a grip on, and the rest of the things can be just a trial and error, and we all sort of need to lead our lives in some respect as a trial and error.
Well, I have to say, Jose, that we really appreciate your doing this interview as one of the hopefully good things, and that yes, the life you can save is trying to affect something that we know will be good by promoting these 25 charities that you can find on our website and help donate to and help resolve your own contradictions, if you will, which is something that we're all struggling to do. And we're hoping some people will be able to do it this way, in part, more effectively. But you've given us a lot at the Life You Can Save in terms of your time, and hopefully that helps you feel good and resolves this tension between fatalism and doing good. You've been very helpful, and I really appreciate your taking the time to do this interview. And I hope to continue our relationship as we both try to do good in an effective way.
I'm happy to speak to you, and it's always fun and always interesting, and I'm happy to give more time.